You probably think beauty is a gift, don't you? A golden ticket, a free pass, a VIP lounge invitation to an easier, more glamorous existence. You imagine a life where doors swing open, where opportunities just land in your perfectly manicured lap. Ah, the sweet, naive dreams of the modern mind. Because in the grim, mud-caked reality of the Middle Ages, particularly if you happen to be born female and blessed, or, as we'll discover, utterly cursed, with exceptional attractiveness, it was less a blessing and more a one-way ticket to a very elaborate, very uncomfortable gilded cage. A cage, mind you, that probably smelled faintly of unwashed sheep, stale ale, and the ever-present pret of dysentery. Not exactly the fragrant boudoir you're picturing, is it? This isn't your average Disney-fied, rose-tinted fairy tale, brimming with handsome princes and glass slippers. Oh no, we're not dealing in happily ever afters here. This is a journey, a rather morbid reevaluation of the perceived gift of attractiveness, viewed through a darker, more cynical, and frankly, more accurate historical lens. We're about to peel back the layers of romanticized notions, revealing medieval beauty not as an advantage, but as a genuine, life-threatening curse. Forget your influencers and your beauty filters. In this era, your face could literally be your downfall, turning you into a tragic figure faster than you could say pestilence. The curse wasn't merely an inconvenience, like an itchy woolen dress or a bad hair day, which, let's be honest, were probably every day. No, it was a profound, pervasive magnet for danger, drawing the eyes of men who saw you as property to be acquired. It was a wellspring of bitter envy, poisoning relationships with other women who viewed you as a threat. It was a prime instrument for relentless political manipulation, where your very existence became a pawn in a game far grander and deadlier than you could ever comprehend. And, perhaps most terrifyingly, your striking looks could even invite the chilling, entirely baseless accusations of witchcraft, a direct express ticket to a very hot, very public bonfire. So, settle in if you can. We're embarking on a slow, methodical, and delightfully morbid journey into the very heart of medieval woes, dissecting the historical anxieties that simmered beneath the surface of daily life. This tale is perfectly paced, not for thrill, but for an intellectually stimulating, yet ultimately delightfully sleep-inducing experience. Picture it as the historical equivalent of a warm glass of milk, only the milk has gone slightly sour, and there's a faint, unsettling whisper of approaching doom in the background. Good night, sweet prince or princess. Prepare for your mind to be gently, let firmly disturbed. Why sleep, you ask? Why dedicate hours to the grim realities of medieval suffering until your eyelids grow heavy and your conscious mind drifts off? Because the true, unvarnished horrors of human history, the subtle and overt cruelties, the sheer, mind-boggling scale of human folly, are often best contemplated in a drowsy, semi-conscious state. It's too much for the harsh light of day, too unsettling for fully alert consideration. Let these stories seep into your subconscious, mingling with your dreams, perhaps giving you a healthy appreciation for the modern era, where at least your beauty won't get you burned at the stake. Probably. Now, before we delve further into the abyss of beautiful medieval suffering, let's clear up a crucial misunderstanding. When I say beautiful, I'm not talking about your modern ideals. You can forget your tanned, toned, perfectly symmetrical, Instagram-filtered vision of attractiveness. Those ideals, born of gym memberships and expensive skincare, would have been utterly alien, if not frankly suspicious, to a medieval eye. No, medieval beauty standards were, quite frankly, unsettling by today's metrics. They were a bizarre concoction of class signifiers, religious dogma, and practical physiological realities, often dictated by the whims of whichever monarch had the most ostentatious court at the time. So, what were these key features? First, and arguably most important, was pale skin. This wasn't just a preference, it was a screaming billboard for your social status. See, if you were pale, it meant you weren't toiling in the sun, hunched over a plow, or scrubbing laundry in a cold stream. It meant you were noble, likely spending your days indoors away from the peasant tanning rays. A hint of a farmer's tan? That was basically a giant scarlet letter, shouting, "I work for a living." You might as well have worn a sign that said, "Future serf right here." Beyond skin, a high forehead was all the rage, so much so that women would often pluck their hair back several inches at the hairline. Imagine the commitment, the pain, the constant regrowth, all for a forehead that screamed, "I'm smart," or at least my skull is prominent. Eyebrows were also fair game for the plucking trend, often thinned or removed entirely. And as for hair, it was frequently light, even artificially colored, perhaps with saffron or other natural dyes, a subtle rebellion against the church's decree that vanity was a sin, even as you bleached your hair with questionable, burning concoctions. And then there was the S-curve, a silhouette that would probably have you doing a double take today. This wasn't about a flat stomach and a thigh gap. Quite the opposite. A rounded belly, a slight, almost pregnant-looking silhouette, was a highly desired trait. Why? Because it screamed fertility, the ultimate purpose of a woman in medieval society. It wasn't a sign of gluttony or too many pastries. It was a clear, biological advertisement for your childbearing potential. Clothing, far from concealing this, often emphasized it, cinching high beneath the breasts to let the natural curve of the abdomen proudly announce, "I am ready for babes." The ideal female form was delicate, almost ethereal, small-breasted, and very much a product of its time, a time when childbirth was a leading cause of death, and a robust womb was more valuable than a robust resume. Of course, this contextual beauty wasn't a monolithic, unchanging ideal across the entire continent. What was considered attractive differed wildly by region, by social class, and even by the reigning fashion whims of the decade. A Northern European ideal might favor robust, fair women, while a Southern European court might appreciate a more olive complexion and darker features. A peasant girl's beauty might be defined by her strength and capability for work, while a noblewoman's would be her delicate idleness. There was no universal ideal, just a myriad of specific anxieties, regional quirks, and fleeting trends, all conspiring to make women feel perpetually inadequate, or worse, perpetually ideals frequently led to illness, disfigurement, or, as we'll soon discover, outright accusations of unholy demonic practices. You'd poison your face with lead to appear pale, only to suffer rashes and hair loss. You'd pluck your eyebrows until they bled for that high forehead look. You'd endure the pain and potential damage of ill-fitting corsetry, though less extreme than later periods, still present, for a fashionable silhouette. All of this just to fit a transient aesthetic, only for that very attractiveness to then become a source of endless suffering. It's almost like the universe was playing a particularly cruel, drawn-out joke. So, you've managed to achieve this rather peculiar medieval standard of beauty. Congratulations, you've now successfully painted a target on your soul. Because in the medieval world, if God made you too attractive, it was probably a test, and you were almost certainly failing it. The Church, being the omnipresent, omnipotent moral compass of the era, viewed beauty in women with an almost pathological suspicion, tracing its roots all the way back to the very first unfortunate apple incident. Biblical roots? Oh yes. From Eve's temptation of Adam, driven by a serpent, and, let's be honest, probably a bit of Eve's own allure, to the more esoteric legends of Lilith, a seductive demonic figure, beauty in women was often intrinsically linked to moral weakness and, more damningly, to original sin itself. It wasn't just a physical trait, it was a spiritual landmine. Women, through their very nature, were seen as the weaker vessel, more susceptible to the devil's whispers, and their beauty was the most potent weapon in his arsenal, designed to lead pious men astray. You were basically a walking, breathing, sin-generating temptation machine, and frankly, God was not amused. Church doctrine was crystal clear. Vanity was unequivocally condemned as one of the 7 deadly sins. Any adornment beyond the bare necessities, any attempt to enhance one's natural appearance was seen as worldly, impious, and a dangerous distraction from the only thing that truly mattered, spiritual devotion and the salvation of your immortal soul. A dab of rouge? That was the devil's blush. A fancy coif? A crown of thorns for your heavenly prospects. The message was subtle as a brick to the face. If you cared too much about your earthly reflection, you clearly cared too little about your eternal destination. And eternity, my friend, is a very long time to regret a trendy hairstyle. For those truly devoted to God, for whom the renunciation of all earthly pleasures was paramount, the path was clear. Monastic ideals championed severe simplicity. Physical attractiveness and any pride in one's appearance were to be actively suppressed, even mortified. Nuns would shave their heads, wear shapeless, coarse habits, and dedicate themselves to a life devoid of personal adornment. This wasn't just about humility. It was a strategic retreat from a world where beauty was a snare, a constant invitation to temptation. In the cloister, at least, your beauty couldn't get you abducted, married off to a tyrant, or burned for witchcraft. Unless the abbess was particularly jealous, of course. The sermonizers, those fire and brimstone preachers whose voices echoed through damp, drafty churches, regularly warned their congregations against the perils of excessive beauty. They painted vivid, terrifying pictures of the damned, their worldly adornments burning with them in the infernal pits. They linked outward beauty directly to the snares of the devil, suggesting that a woman who spent too much time primping was essentially collaborating with Lucifer himself. Imagine sitting in a cold stone church, listening to a man in a scratchy woolen robe declare that your perfectly plucked eyebrows were a direct affront to the Almighty. It certainly puts a damper on one's self-esteem. So the subtle message, woven into the very fabric of medieval religious thought, was this: if you were too beautiful, you were probably, subtly or not so subtly, depending on the preacher's mood, in league with the forces of darkness. Your allure was suspect, your charm a devilish enchantment. God, it seemed, was certainly not impressed, and might, in fact, be rather actively displeased. And in an era where divine displeasure meant plague, famine, and eternal damnation, being a stunner was less a boon and more an existential threat to your immortal soul. Talk about pressure. All right, you've survived the theological condemnation, the whispers of the clergy. But now you step out of the church, blinking in the harsh medieval sunlight, and into the truly physical, terrifying reality of your curse. Because if you were a beautiful woman in the Middle Ages, you were, to put it mildly, open season. Your attractiveness wasn't a shield. It was a beacon, unfortunately, for male aggression, for unwanted advances that felt like thinly veiled threats, and for opportunistic predation that viewed you as little more than a desirable piece of chattel. This was an era utterly devoid of a #MeToo movement, an age where the concept of consent was often as elusive as a reliable cure for the common cold. Legal recourse for women was, to be generous, minimal. If you were assaulted or subjected to unwanted advances, society's blame, with a sickening consistency, often fell squarely on the victim. Your beauty, your very presence, was deemed the provocation, the siren call that led men astray. It was your fault for being attractive, your fault for existing, your fault for tempting, not his for his lack of restraint. Imagine that chilling logic. You're the victim, but also the perpetrator. A real head-scratcher for anyone with a shred of modern decency. Compounding this was the pervasive property mindset. Women, regardless of their social standing, were frequently viewed as possessions, first of their fathers, then of their husbands, and sometimes even of their brothers. And an attractive woman? She was simply a more desirable acquisition, a more valuable piece of property to be shown off, traded, or seized, entirely irrespective of her feelings, her desires, or her very personhood. Her thoughts, her opinions, her dreams, irrelevant. Her face and her fertility? Pure gold, or at least a very useful currency in a world run by men. This particular brand of danger permeated all social strata. Whether you were a noblewoman, swathed in expensive and probably still itchy silks, or a peasant girl with calloused hands and a faded homespun gown, your underlying vulnerability was universal. For the noblewoman, it might be the lecherous gaze of a powerful lord, the threat of an unwanted arranged marriage to some doddering baron, or the constant fear of abduction. For the peasant, it could be the even more terrifying droit du seigneur. Differed, yes, but the constant, gnawing threat was the same. Can you imagine the psychological burden of this constant vigilance? The perpetual awareness of being watched, judged, scrutinized, and always potentially targeted? Every public outing, every interaction, every passing glance, a silent assessment of your vulnerability. Constant, low-level anxiety, that perpetual need to be on guard, would be utterly draining. Forget your modern-day social media pressures. This was real-world, life-or-death, soul-crushing pressure, and it was exhausting, isn't it? So you're beautiful, you're a target, and sometimes The most direct path to acquiring such a valuable target was simply to take her. Dubious method for securing a wife, particularly if she was wealthy, well-connected, or simply too alluring to be ignored. Forget the romance. This was brute force in a world where might often made right, and a woman's consent was a mere afterthought. The heiress snatch was a particularly popular medieval pastime for ambitious men with more audacity than ethics. Beautiful, wealthy women, especially those with substantial inheritances, were exceptionally vulnerable. Their dual blessings, beauty and property, made them irresistible targets for men eager to climb the social ladder, secure land, or simply consolidate power. It wasn't about love, it was about assets. Your face was just the shiny lure, and your dowry was the real prize. You might find yourself riding off into the sunrise, not on a white horse to your true love, but flung over the saddle of some brutish stranger's steed, heading for a lifetime of forced servitude under the guise of marriage. And here's where medieval law gets truly infuriating. Sometimes, if an abduction led to a marriage, especially if it was consummated, the union was considered legally binding, regardless of the woman's consent. Think about that for a moment. A man could literally kidnap you, force himself upon you, and then declare you his wife, with the church and the law reluctantly nodding along, shrugging their shoulders and saying, "Well, it's done now, isn't it?" Your beauty, once a source of admiration, now became the ultimate trap. Your body, unfortunately, becoming someone else's decision, someone else's property, and your future utterly stolen. The lack of consent in these situations is truly chilling. The woman's will, her desires, her basic human autonomy were utterly disregarded. Her beauty wasn't her own. It was a commodity, a public good, an open invitation for others to lay claim. Her tears, her pleas, her struggles, they meant nothing against the force of a determined suitor, or, more accurately, a determined abductor. Her life was irrevocably altered, her identity subsumed, all because her face and fortune were deemed too tempting to resist. It's a stark reminder that in some historical periods, having desirable traits made you less, not more, human in the eyes of the law. And the consequences for the family? Oh, they were dire. Such an event could lead to profound dishonor, sparking violent feuds that could last for generations, culminating in bloodshed and endless retribution. Or, just as frequently, it could lead to a grudging acceptance of a fait accompli, a done deal. Better to have your daughter married, even under duress, than to have her dishonored and unmarriable. So a medieval rom-com? This was certainly not. More like a medieval horror film disguised as a societal norm. You're the star, darling, but you definitely didn't audition for this role. If abduction was the brute force method, then forced marriage was its slightly more civilized, though no less cruel cousin. For a beautiful woman of noble birth, your face wasn't just your face. It was a valuable commodity, a strategic asset, your very existence a potential future for your country, or perhaps its dramatic downfall. Forget personal happiness or emotional compatibility. Your beauty was a tool, a weapon, a bargaining chip in the relentless, high-stakes game of dynastic politics. The cold, calculating calculus of medieval marital markets was brutal. Age, lineage, wealth, and, yes, looks all factored into the ruthless equations of power. Was she young enough to bear many heirs? Was her family powerful enough to bring a strong alliance? Was her dowry substantial? And was she beautiful enough to please her future husband and secure the bond? Personal feelings? Irrelevant. Love? A distant, almost laughable concept, utterly secondary to the urgent needs of the crown or the family name. You were a living, breathing chess piece, and your beauty just gave you a higher square on the board. So there was no love lost, literally, in these arranged marriages. For the nobility, marriage was about alliances, about securing peace, about consolidating power, about extending influence, and above all, about producing legitimate heirs to carry on the family line. Your beauty was merely a finely crafted bargaining chip, a gilded invitation to the negotiating table. It might secure a more powerful husband, yes, but it didn't guarantee kindness, fidelity, or even a shared language. Often, your primary role was to look pleasant, produce heirs, and then quietly fade into the background, a decorative incubator in a magnificent, uncomfortable castle. Being sent off to a foreign court, sometimes to marry a stranger you'd never met, sometimes a much older man, sometimes an actual enemy of your own people, was a grim reality for many attractive noblewomen. Imagine packing your trunks, knowing you're traveling across hostile lands to meet a man whose reputation precedes him, and not in a good way. A man you are legally bound to, whose moods you must anticipate, whose demands you must meet, all because your pretty face sealed a treaty. It was less a wedding, more a geopolitical transfer of property, and you were the prize package. The beautiful bride, therefore, was often little more than a symbol. Adorned in silks and jewels, she was presented as the living embodiment of an alliance, a guarantee of future stability, or a testament to the power of her family. But beneath the glittering facade, she was often without a voice, without agency, her primary role to look decorative, be fertile, and, for God's sake, don't cause a diplomatic incident. Her beauty got her there, yes, but it also painted her into a very specific, very restrictive corner, where her ultimate worth was measured in the strength of her womb and the strength of the treaties she brought. A truly exhausting performance, wouldn't you agree? You'd think, wouldn't you, that if you had a daughter blessed with such captivating beauty, the dowry would be a mere formality. Perhaps even that her looks would reduce the financial burden, given her obvious value in the marital market. Oh, you sweet modern optimist. In the medieval world, the opposite was often true. A beautiful daughter, far from being a financial relief, might actually command a higher dowry. Her striking looks, you see, ironically increased the perceived value of the marital match, thus inflating the financial burden on her poor, beleaguered family. It was like paying extra for the premium model, even though you had no choice in the matter. This could place an immense strain on the family, particularly if they weren't exactly swimming in ducats. Could they actually afford to marry her off appropriately? Her beauty might inflate the price of her freedom, or rather, her transfer of ownership, pushing her family to the brink of financial ruin just to secure a match deemed worthy of her looks. Imagine the family meeting. Agnes is stunning, truly a vision, but we might have to sell the east pasture to get her a decent husband. And what about poor, plain Beatrice? It was a constant balancing act between social advancement and the very real threat of economic collapse, all because one daughter was a bit too comely. And speaking of Beatrice, the beauty of one daughter could profoundly disadvantage her sisters. If the eldest daughter was a renowned beauty, a significant portion of the family's liquid assets, or land or livestock, would be funneled into her dowry, leaving her less attractive sisters with considerably less to offer. Their dowries would then seem paltry by comparison, making their marital prospects significantly dimmer. So, while one sister received all the attention and the accompanying dangers, the others were left to languish, effectively punished for not being as aesthetically blessed, or for having a sister who was too blessed. Sibling rivalry takes on a whole new dimension when your sister's face means your future is significantly worse. Marriage contracts were, as you might imagine, incredibly elaborate legal documents. These weren't flowery declarations of love. They were cold, hard financial agreements. They meticulously detailed her worth, her property, her future entitlements, and her husband's obligations, with little to no input from the bride herself. Her beauty might be mentioned, perhaps as a flattering aside, but it was the number of fields, the herd of cattle, or the chest of coins that truly mattered. You were essentially a clause in a very complicated legal document, your entire future dictated by parchment and quill. Ultimately, her financial ruin or social advancement, her very place in society, all hinged precariously on her face and the weight of her family's purse. It was a brutal, transactional world where beauty was a double-edged sword. It might get you noticed, but it would also cost you and your family dearly. You were paying a premium for a potentially dangerous commodity, a lifetime of uncomfortable compromises, all for the privilege of being desired. Doesn't sound quite so glamorous now, does it? All right, you've navigated the treacherous waters of biblical condemnation and the financial quagmire of dowries. But now, let's talk about the more insidious, everyday misery that beauty invited. The simmering cauldron of jealousy and envy. Because if you were a beautiful woman in the medieval court or village, you weren't just attracting the gaze of powerful men, you were also attracting the full, unfiltered venom of other women. And let me tell you, female rivalries in the Middle Ages could be sharper, more cunning, and far more psychologically damaging than any sword fight. Other women, especially those less fortunate in the genetic lottery, or those competing for the same limited pool of eligible men, or more likely, powerful patrons, saw your allure as a direct threat. They could, and often would, turn hostile. This wasn't just about a bit of friendly competition. It could escalate into petty cruelty, social ostracization, or even outright sabotage. Imagine walking into the bustling marketplace or the hushed chambers of the court, knowing that every smile, every compliment you received was generating a fresh wave of resentment and a fresh set of enemies. It's like being a celebrity in a very small, very vengeful town. Poisonous whispers were, in the absence of Twitter, the most potent weapons in a jealous woman's arsenal. Slander, gossip, and rumor were capable of destroying a reputation faster than you could say divine judgment, with a single, well-placed insinuation. A raised eyebrow, a dismissive sniff, a murmured comment about your loose morals or your unnatural charm. That was all it took. And once a reputation was tarnished, especially a woman's, it was almost impossible to scrub clean. Your beauty, ironically, made you an easier target, as any hint of impropriety seemed more believable when attributed to such a desirable figure. Social ostracization was another common consequence. Being excluded from female circles, left lonely and isolated, was a psychological torment that could be just as brutal as physical punishment. Women relied on each other for support, for community, for shared tasks and gossip. To be cut off, to be subtly, or not so subtly, ignored, to find doors closed and conversations halted as you approached, that was a truly devastating blow. Your beauty, which you might think would open doors, instead built walls, trapping you in a lonely, glittering prison of your own making. And the green-eyed monster wasn't limited to your female peers. Even powerful men, particularly those whose advances you might have spurned, or those who felt threatened by your influence over other men, might resent your power derived from mere beauty. A man whose pride was wounded might turn from admirer to antagonist, finding ways to undermine your standing, question your virtue, or simply make your life a living hell. After all, if he couldn't have you, he certainly wouldn't want anyone else to enjoy your perceived advantages. So imagine living under this perpetual gaze of envy, the constant psychological pressure, the need to anticipate hostility, to guard your words, to watch your back. It's hardly conducive to peace of mind, is it? Every success was viewed with suspicion, every compliment with a sneer. Your beauty, far from bringing joy, delivered a constant, gnawing anxiety, making you question every interaction and trust virtually no one. A heavy crown indeed, and a truly exhausting way to live. If beauty was a beacon, then a woman's reputation in the Middle Ages was a fragile, gossamer thread, constantly under threat, ready to snap with the slightest breath of scandal. And for a beautiful woman, that thread was even finer, more exposed, more dangerously fragile. Your honor, your good name, your very standing in society, it could all be astonishingly easily tarnished by a whisper, a malicious glance, or the casual cruelty of a jealous rival. It was the medieval equivalent of going viral for all the wrong reasons, but with far, far more dire consequences. The most common, and perhaps most devastating accusation leveled against a beautiful woman was promiscuity. Her very attractiveness was often, and unfairly, equated with loose morals, an eagerness to stray, and a lack of virtue. If she was alluring, she must be wanton. If men noticed her, she must be inviting their attention. This was the twisted logic of the age. A single rumor, a mistaken sighting, or a fabricated story could brand her as a harlot or whore, destroying her marriage prospects, isolating her socially, and condemning her to a life of shame. And her beauty, which drew all this attention, made the accusations stick with a chilling, damning credibility. For even perceived transgressions, women faced truly severe punishments. We're not talking about a Twitter pile-on here. We're talking about real-world, public shaming. Imagine being forced into the stocks in the middle of the village square, pelted with rotten fruit and refuse, your reputation and your dignity irrevocably shattered. Or the ducking stool, a terrifying contraption that repeatedly plunged suspected scolds or witches into icy water, often until unconsciousness or worse. Or, perhaps most common and equally devastating, simply being shunned by the community, becoming a pariah, an outcast, a ghost in your own village. The damage was often irreversible. A reputation once soiled in medieval society was almost impossible to clean. There was no PR team, no opportunity for a carefully crafted apology, no way to control the narrative once it had taken root. The stain of scandal would follow you, cling to you, defining you for the rest of your days. You might move to a new village, but the whispers would inevitably follow, perpetuated by traveling merchants, pilgrims, or simply the ingrained prejudice against anyone with a past deemed unseemly. And this is where beauty became a particularly cruel twist of fate. The very quality that set her apart, that made her noticeable, that seemed like a blessing, was also the quality that drew the kind of attention that could utterly destroy her. Her striking looks made her visible, made her a target, made her a topic of conversation, and thus made her vulnerable to the malicious tongues of those who envied or resented her. Her face, her figure, her very presence became a lightning rod for the kind of scrutiny and judgment that could dismantle her life entirely. A true tragedy wrapped in a pretty package, wouldn't you agree? All right, you've sidestepped the scandal, managed to keep your reputation mostly intact. But now, dear listener, we descend into the truly terrifying depths of the medieval curse of beauty, the direct express train to accusations of witchcraft. Because in a world where everything unusual was suspect and female power was viewed with profound distrust, exceptional beauty, particularly if accompanied by charisma or influence, could very easily be attributed to demonic influence or unnatural enchantments. If you were too gorgeous, too charming, too compelling, you weren't blessed by God. You were clearly in league with the devil himself. The femme fatale archetype wasn't a modern invention. It had its chilling medieval precursor. A woman's beauty wasn't just a harmless distraction, a bit of eye candy. It was seen as a tool of the devil, a diabolical instrument used to ensnare and corrupt pious men. Her captivating gaze, her charming smile, her alluring presence, all were interpreted as enchantments, dark magic designed to lead good, God-fearing men away from righteousness and straight into the waiting clutches of sin. You weren't just pretty, you were a walking, talking, devilish trap, probably with a subtle whiff of brimstone about you, just for added effect. Now, you might recall that it was often older, solitary women who bore the brunt of witchcraft accusations, but an unnervingly attractive young woman could also raise serious suspicions. Why was she so radiant, so captivating? What dark pact had she made for such a flawless complexion or such sparkling eyes? It wasn't natural, surely. God didn't dole out such blatant gifts without a catch, did he? So, if you were just a bit too beautiful to be believable, if your charm seemed to sway men with an uncanny ease, people might start wondering if you weren't using a little bit of dark magic to achieve your devastating effects. And these accusations, you can imagine, often came from entirely predictable sources. Spurned lovers, whose pride was wounded by your rejection, might find it far easier to brand you a witch than to admit their own inadequacy. Or perhaps a jealous rival, seeing your beauty as an unfair advantage in the relentless social ladder climbing of medieval life, might find that a whispered accusation of sorcery was a convenient way to eliminate competition or exact a particularly satisfying revenge. It was a brutal, cynical game, and your beauty made you a perfect, high-profile target. The stakes, my friend, were beyond anything we can comprehend today. An accusation of witchcraft could lead to torture, a trial by ordeal, which was basically a medieval game of Russian roulette with a much higher body count, and ultimately the horrifying prospect of being burned at the stake. Imagine that for a moment. Your life, your very existence, reduced to a flickering flame, your screams mingling with the cheers of a zealous crowd, all because you had a nice face. It's a chilling reminder that in the Middle Ages, appearing too good to be true was often just a prelude to a truly agonizing, fiery end. Your beauty was indeed a curse, a literal death sentence waiting to be enacted. Let's unpack this demonic link a bit further, because it wasn't just isolated accusations. It was a deeply ingrained theological perspective that systematically demonized female attractiveness. This wasn't a bug in the medieval system, it was a core feature. From the earliest church fathers to the fire and brimstone preachers of the later Middle Ages, there was a remarkably consistent narrative painting women as temptresses, as the weaker vessel, and, most damningly, as the very gateway to sin. And beauty, naturally, was the most potent weapon in this spiritual arsenal of damnation. Patristic writings, the foundational texts of early Christian theology, were particularly scathing. Figures like Tertullian, an early Christian author, famously called women the devil's gateway, a direct conduit for sin and temptation. He and others were remarkably consistent in their portrayal. Women were inherently flawed, their bodies alluring traps, their very existence a constant test of male piety. Your beauty, therefore, wasn't just a physical attribute. It was a constant, living testament to humanity's fall from grace, a perpetual reminder of Eve's transgression. Talk about a heavy burden to carry, merely for having a pleasant visage. The inherent sinfulness of female beauty was a constant refrain. It was often seen as inherently dangerous, a potent distraction from the righteous path of piety, and a constant reminder of the flesh's weakness, rather than a celebration of God's creation. A beautiful woman was not seen as a testament to divine artistry. She was a challenge, a stumbling block, a seductive hurdle placed squarely in the path of male spiritual advancement. It was a worldview that conveniently absolved male desire by placing the blame squarely on the object of that desire. Therefore, warnings against excessive ornamentation were relentless and severe. Elaborate hairstyles, expensive, clinging garments, and any form of makeup were all seen as outward signs of inner depravity, acts of rebellion against God's natural order. Why would you try to improve upon God's creation unless you were trying to deceive, to tempt, to ensnare? Such vanity was not just a personal failing, it was a public declaration of your spiritual corruption, a direct challenge to the austerity and humility championed by the Church. You might as well wear a sign declaring your allegiance to the forces of hell. And this brings us to the delightful medieval double standard. Male desire was often explained away as a natural, if regrettable, consequence of original sin, a weakness of the flesh that could be managed, preferably by avoiding beautiful women entirely. But female beauty? That was deemed the cause of that desire, thus making the woman culpable, the active agent of temptation. She wasn't just beautiful, she was responsible for every impure thought, every lustful glance, every moment of male weakness. Her allure was the crime, and her very existence was the evidence. This theological demonization cast a long, dark shadow of misogyny over the entire period. Beauty was weaponized against women, reinforcing their perceived inferiority, their dangerous nature, and their subordinate role in society. It wasn't just that beauty could lead to problems. It was that beauty was itself a problem, a mark of suspicion, a burden on the soul, and a constant threat to the spiritual well-being of Christendom. So, congratulations! Your stunning looks just made you an instrument of the devil. Hope it was worth all that lead makeup. So you're caught in this theological vice. On one hand, you're trying to live your life. On the other, the church is preaching fire and brimstone about vanity, yet simultaneously, the world expects you to be appealing. It's a constant, maddening contradiction. A push and pull between the sacred and the profane. And for women, it often meant a desperate attempt to walk a tightrope over a very deep chasm of sin and social condemnation. Holy women, those who achieved sainthood or a reputation for profound piety, often provided a stark and, frankly, disturbing counter-narrative. Their lives frequently featured tales of deliberate self-mutilation or severe neglect of their physical beauty. Why? To avoid tempting men, of course, or to offer a dramatic demonstration of their absolute devotion to God. Imagine deliberately disfiguring yourself, cutting your hair, wearing sackcloth, or even enduring extreme fasting to render yourself unattractive. It wasn't just about humility, it was a desperate physical rejection of the very attribute that society and the church deemed so dangerous. Their suffering was a testament to their sanctity, and their disfigurement, ironically, a mark of their spiritual beauty. For many women, particularly those from noble families seeking to escape the very real dangers of marriage and worldly entanglement, becoming a nun offered a unique sanctuary. It was a strategic retreat, a haven from the unwanted male gaze, from the pressures of dynastic marriages, and from the relentless scrutiny that came with being an attractive woman in a brutal world. Within the cloister, your beauty was irrelevant. Your devotion was everything. It was a different kind of cage, perhaps, but one where you had a modicum more control over your own spiritual destiny, if not your physical appearance. The secular dilemma, then, was this. How could a woman be attractive enough to secure a good marriage, to fulfill her societal role of producing heirs and maintaining her family status, but not so sinful as to invite divine wrath or social condemnation? It was a delicate tightrope walk, a balancing act between pleasing men and their families and pleasing God. Too plain, and you might be unmarriageable. Too beautiful, and you might be a temptress bound for hell. Find that sweet spot, ladies, or face eternal damnation or a lonely spinsterhood. Good luck. This subtle, pervasive pressure to balance earthly desires with the promise of eternal salvation was a constant, unsettling challenge. Every decision about clothing, about hair, about social interaction was weighed against its potential impact on one's immortal soul. Was that new gown too ostentatious? Would this flirtatious glance lead to an impure thought? In him, of course, never in you. It was a constant internal monologue of spiritual risk assessment, making every aspect of self-presentation a moral minefield. And let's not forget the delicious hypocrisy. While clergy would preach condemnation of vanity and beauty from their pulpits, they were, after all, still human. Many would undoubtedly fall prey to its allure themselves, secretly admiring what they publicly condemned. There was an inherent contradiction in a system that demonized female beauty while simultaneously being utterly captivated by it. It was a constant, unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement that even the most pious could not escape the ancient, unsettling power of human attraction, even as they damned it to hell. So, you've tried to navigate the church's contradictions, you've worried about accusations of witchcraft, but what about the more personal, internal curse of beauty, the vanity trap? Because to take undue pride in one's looks, to admire oneself a little too much, was considered one of the deadliest sins, a direct offense against God, who, after all, gave you that beauty in the first place. You didn't earn it. It was a loan from the Almighty. And if you started acting like you owned it, well, that was just rude, wasn't it? The humble mirror, that seemingly innocuous tool of self-reflection, became a perilous object in the medieval world. It was no longer just a way to check your coif. It was a potential gateway to sin, a tool of self-admiration that could lead you down the slippery slope of pride. Self-reflection, yes, but perhaps not the good, introspective kind that leads to spiritual growth. No, this was the superficial kind, the, oh, I look good today kind. And that, my friend, was a direct path to the infernal pits. Imagine having to guiltily peek at your reflection, feeling the weight of potential damnation just for wanting to ensure you didn't have spinach in your teeth. The church didn't pull its punches here. For those deemed excessively vain or who flaunted their beauty in inappropriate ways, excommunication threats loomed large. This wasn't a minor slap on the wrist. Excommunication meant being cut off from the sacraments, banished from the Christian community, and effectively condemned to eternal damnation without the possibility of salvation. All because you wore a particularly fetching wimple or had an exceptionally charming smile. The medieval stakes for looking good were truly astronomical. This led to a constant internal struggle for many women. How much was too much? To care for oneself, to present oneself respectably, or to deliberately neglect one's appearance for the sake of piety? It was a difficult choice with very real, and in the medieval mind, eternal consequences. Every decision about dress, about grooming, about public presentation was fraught with spiritual peril. You couldn't just throw on an outfit, you had to consider its impact on your immortal soul. It made getting ready in the morning a deeply theological exercise. Ultimately, beauty was seen as a profound distraction, a distraction from prayer, from good works, from charity, from the contemplation of one's immortal soul and the glory of God. It diverted attention to the fleeting, superficial world of the flesh, away from the eternal, spiritual realm. So, if you were beautiful, you were not only a temptation to others, but a constant temptation to yourself, a perpetual obstacle on the path to true piety. Your reflection was not just a mirror, it was a potential trap, a direct route to spiritual downfall. And all because your features were a bit too symmetrical. What an absolute nightmare. All right, let's turn to a slightly more glamorous, though ultimately even more perilous path that beauty could pave, becoming a royal favorite or mistress. You might think, finally a positive use for beauty, gaining influence, wealth, and even political sway through a monarch's affections. It sounds appealing, doesn't it? A life of luxury, fine clothes, jewels, and whispered power. But make no mistake, this was less a rise to power and more a tightrope walk over a pit of vipers, with the rope made of increasingly fragile threads of royal affection and your own fleeting youth. The position was, by its very nature, incredibly precarious. You held no legitimate claim to power. Your influence was entirely reliant on the fickle affections of a powerful man. One wrong move, one overheard indiscretion, one new, younger face in the court, or indeed, one wrinkle too many, and it was all over. You were a flower, beautiful and fragrant, but destined to wilt. And once you did, you'd be discarded as swiftly and ruthlessly as yesterday's garbage. Your beauty was your currency, and like all currencies, it depreciated with alarming speed. And enemies? Oh, you had them everywhere. From the aggrieved, furious queen, whose legitimate position you were undermining, to jealous courtiers who resented your unearned influence and proximity to power, the mistress was an object of hatred, resentment, and profound suspicion. Every move you made was scrutinized, every gift you received tallied, every word you whispered to the king dissected for ulterior motives. You were a convenient scapegoat for any misfortune, a lightning rod for all the court's frustrations. It was a lonely, terrifying position where trust was a luxury you could ill afford. Then came the inevitable aging curse. What happens when the beauty that propelled you into such a dizzying, dangerous position begins to fade? When the youth that captivated the king inevitably gives way to the lines of age, the subtle changes that mark the passage of time, often it meant dismissal, banishment from court, impoverishment, or exile. Your utility had expired, your purpose served. You might have amassed some wealth, but your protection, your status, and your very reason for being at court had vanished. You were a spent commodity, tossed aside with little thought, a ghost of your former alluring self. The ultimate fate for many royal mistresses was often tragic. Disgraced, exiled, or worse, once their utility and beauty expired, they faced a grim end. Some were forced into convents, a convenient way to neutralize their influence and remove them from public view. Others lived out their days in obscurity, their former splendor a bitter memory. A few, like Agnes Sorel, even met sudden, mysterious deaths, often rumored to be poisoning. It was a brief, glittering, and ultimately dangerous career path where your face bought you a few years of luxury, but often at the cost of your future, your safety, and sometimes your very life. A truly cursed form of power, indeed. Now, if being a mistress was precarious, being a royal bride, particularly a beautiful one, was a meticulously crafted, high-stakes game of political chess. And you, my dear, were the queen. Not the ruling monarch, mind you, but the most valuable and vulnerable piece on the board, a commodity whose primary function was to secure alliances, propagate dynasties, and occasionally look pretty at state functions. Your personal feelings were about as relevant as the price of tea in China. These were high-stakes marriages where entire alliances, intricate treaties, and even the fate of kingdoms hinged on a woman's appearance and, crucially, her fertility. Imagine the pressure. Your face wasn't just representing you, it was representing your entire nation. Your ability to bear healthy sons was not just a biological function. It was a matter of national security. You were literally the living embodiment of a peace treaty, and if you failed to live up to expectations, the consequences could be war, famine, and dynastic collapse. No pressure, though. Just smile and look fertile. Before the actual marriage, there was often the rather dehumanizing ritual of her inspection. Imagine being paraded, examined, and judged purely on your looks, your physical health, and your potential to produce heirs. Doctors, envoys, and sometimes even the prospective husband himself would scrutinize your teeth, your limbs, your complexion, ensuring you were fit for purpose. It was less a meeting and more a livestock auction, where your physical attributes were meticulously assessed for their political and reproductive value. Your humanity, your intelligence, your charm, utterly secondary to your visible condition and the strength of your womb. Then came the arranged marriage lottery. Who would you be saddled with? A child, barely older than yourself, who would one day inherit a kingdom? An old man, doddering and ill, whose only purpose was to secure an heir before his inevitable demise? A notorious tyrant whose cruelty was whispered in every court? Or perhaps, if you were truly lucky, someone simply unpleasant, with bad breath and a worse temper. The dice were cast, your fate sealed, and your beauty merely determined which particular brand of misery you were assigned. This meant a profound lack of personal agency. A beautiful woman's life, especially if she was of royal blood, was meticulously mapped out for her, often from birth. Her future was a tapestry woven by her father, her uncles, and her advisors, with no input from her own desires or aspirations. Her destiny was to be married, to produce heirs, and to serve as a living symbol, her individual identity subsumed by her dynastic purpose. You were a very expensive, very beautiful puppet, with invisible strings pulling you through a life you didn't choose. And what happened when her beauty, or her fertility, failed to deliver the promised results? If she couldn't secure peace, if she couldn't produce the necessary male heirs, she often took the blame, regardless of the circumstances. She might be repudiated, sent back to her family in disgrace, or even imprisoned. Her beauty, which had opened the door to such a powerful union, became the very thing that condemned her when expectations weren't met. It was a no-win scenario, a gilded trap where your greatest asset could also become your greatest liability. So far, we've discussed very real, very tangible dangers. But let's turn our attention to something a bit more ephemeral, a bit more poetic, yet no less dangerous for the medieval beauty: the concept of courtly love. On the surface, it sounds rather charming, doesn't it? Flowery poems, gallant knights, idealized adoration from afar. You might imagine a life where men worshipped your beauty from a safe, respectful distance. Oh, how sweetly naive of you. Because the theoretical beauty of courtly love contrasted sharply with the messy, dangerous, and often brutally violent of human emotions and male entitlement. The theoretical versus the practical. Troubadours sang ballads of knights pining for their unattainable ladies, performing brave deeds in their honor, their love pure and chaste. But in the real world, this idealized adoration often led to dangerous liaisons, secret affairs, and, inevitably, adultery. And adultery in the Middle Ages was not a whispered scandal. It was a crime, carrying brutal consequences if discovered. We're talking imprisonment, public shaming, disfigurement, or even execution. So while your beauty might inspire a sonnet, it could also inspire a jealous husband to remove your nose. A rather steep price for poetic admiration, wouldn't you agree? Courtly love, for all its romantic trappings, often placed women in an impossible position. They were burdened by impossible expectations of purity, grace, eternal beauty, and unattainable perfection. They were meant to be inspiring muses, objects of worship, rather than sentient partners with their own desires and agency. They became trophies, symbols of male prowess rather than individuals. This dehumanizing idealization meant you were admired, yes, but rarely truly seen or respected as a complex human being. You were a painting, a statue, a poem, anything but an equal. And when these idealized affections inevitably soured or led to discovery, men often fought over a beautiful woman's honor or perceived lack thereof. Duels, feuds, and violent confrontations were common, with the woman herself often a passive trigger for male violence, rather than an active participant in her own fate. Your beauty became the spark, the justification for men to hack each other to pieces, all in the name of your name, your virtue, or your rejection. You were the trophy, the prize, the ultimate symbol of male victory, even as your life became a terrifying spectacle. So, in essence, the woman in courtly love was ultimately a trophy, a beautiful ornament, the ultimate prize in the romantic drama playing out around her. She was rarely an active participant in her own fate, merely the catalyst, the beautiful object around which the action revolved. Her attractiveness might make her the subject of grand gestures and passionate declarations, but it also made her the unwitting subject of dangerous games, where her feelings, her safety, and her very life were secondary to the romantic ideals and violent passions of the men around her. A rather hollow victory, wouldn't you say? Let's strip away the poetic fluff of courtly love and get down to the truly grim reality that beauty invited: direct physical peril from admirers. You might imagine a charming suitor, a respectful gentleman. In the Middle Ages, however, refusal often meant little to determined, entitled men. The concept of no wasn't just a suggestion. It was often a concept universally ignored or actively disrespected, especially when directed at a desirable woman. Your beauty, instead of offering protection, made you a perpetual target. There was simply no concept of personal space or boundaries as we understand them today. The idea of a woman's body being her own sovereign domain, inviolable and sacrosanct, was utterly alien to many. She was public property, an object of public gaze, and by extension, an object subject to public handling. This wasn't just a theoretical problem, it was a daily reality. Women were constantly subjected to uninvited physical contact, to grabbing arms, to lingering touches that went far beyond mere politeness. Imagine the constant flinching, the perpetual need to brace yourself against unwelcome hands, all because your face was deemed appealing. This touch culture was unfortunately common and incredibly difficult to prevent. In crowded markets, at bustling fairs, even within the confines of a manor, a beautiful woman was seen as fair game. There was no one to intervene, no concept of sexual harassment, no HR department to file a complaint with. You were simply expected to endure it, perhaps with a forced smile, lest you be accused of being a scold or unladylike. Your body was public property, and your feelings about it were entirely irrelevant. And if persuasion, or rather persistent harassment, force might be next, her attractiveness could make her a prime target for outright assault. The dark corners of an alley, the isolated path to the well, the remote parts of a manor, these were all places where a woman's beauty could be her undoing. The idea of taking what you want was tragically common, especially for men of higher status who felt entitled to peasant women, or even noble women under certain circumstances. Your beauty, instead of deterring such acts, actively invited them. So imagine living in a perpetual state of fear. Your beauty, which others might envy, became a heavy cloak of anxiety, making you an accessible target for any man who felt entitled to your attention, your touch, or your body. It forced a constant state of vigilance, a perpetual awareness of your surroundings, and a deep-seated need for self-preservation that must have been utterly exhausting. Your face was a magnet for trouble, and every time you stepped out your door, you risked attracting the kind of attention that could shatter your life. A curse, indeed, but one that was physically, terrifyingly real. Now, if you thought the social and spiritual curses were bad, let's talk about the physical ones, because achieving medieval beauty standards often involved a literal self-poisoning. You wanted that coveted complexion, didn't you? That luminous, aristocratic glow that screamed, "I never see the sun, peasant." Well, darling, for that, women literally poisoned themselves with lead-based makeup. Ceruse, a white lead pigment, was mixed into powders and creams and liberally applied to the face and neck. The result? A ghostly pallor, yes, but also skin damage, hair loss, festering sores, and eventually chronic illness, neurological problems, and even death. It was a slow, agonizing process of looking good while slowly rotting from the inside out. Talk about commitment to a look. And what about those wide, sparkling doe eyes that were so fashionable? For that, women used belladonna eye drops. Belladonna, literally beautiful lady, is derived from deadly nightshade. A few drops would dilate the pupils, giving you that enchanting, wide-eyed look. The pleasant side effects? Blurred vision, extreme light sensitivity, migraines, and the potential for permanent blindness. So you might look alluring, but you probably couldn't see where you were going, and a bright sunny day would feel like staring directly at the sun. All for a fleeting, dangerous aesthetic that could leave you stumbling around blindly. Hair removal was another delightful medieval beauty ritual. For that pristine high hairline and the fashionably plucked eyebrows, women resorted to painful and often scarring methods. Harsh chemicals, concoctions made from arsenic or quicklime, were applied to dissolve hair, often resulting in severe skin burns, permanent discoloration, and even infections. Or, if you preferred a more natural approach, you'd pluck them with rough tweezers, a slow, agonizing process that left your skin red, inflamed, and often scarred. The pursuit of smoothness often left you with a face that looked like it had been through a particularly aggressive medieval brawl. And let's not forget corsetry. While not as extreme as the Victorian wasp waists, medieval fashion still involved deforming the body for a fashionable silhouette. Bodices and kirtles, often reinforced with whalebone or wood, were cinched tight, pushing the breasts up and compressing the torso. This might give you that desired delicate, ethereal look, but it also led to organ displacement, breathing difficulties, chronic back pain, and restricted movement. Imagine trying to breathe deeply, eat a full meal, or even walk without discomfort, all because your ribs were being reshaped for the sake of fashion. So the price of beauty in the Middle Ages was often a shortened lifespan, chronic illness, and permanent disfigurement, all in the name of looking good by the rather twisted standards of the era. You were literally sacrificing your health, your comfort, and your longevity to conform to an aesthetic that might get you married, but would probably also kill you. It was a stark reminder that vanity wasn't just a spiritual sin, it was a very real, very physical form of slow, agonizing suicide. And that, my friend, is a curse written in blood, lead, and poisonous berries. If toxic cosmetics weren't enough, let's talk about another self-inflicted misery, the medieval diet of desire. You see, the concept of anorexia nervosa, far from being a modern invention, has roots stretching back deep into history. Women, for spiritual or aesthetic reasons, literally starve themselves, seeking an ethereal, delicate look that spoke of piety, refinement, and an almost otherworldly grace. It wasn't just about weight loss. It was about transforming the physical into something seemingly divine, or at least something socially aspirational. That delicate look was highly prized. Frailty and a slight build were often considered unmistakable signs of upper-class status, indicating a life free from the back-breaking manual labor that coarsened the bodies of peasants. If you were thin, it meant you didn't have to work in the fields. It meant you had servants to do your bidding. It meant you were a lady, and ladies, by definition, were delicate. So a gaunt appearance wasn't a sign of illness, it was a badge of honor, a silent boast of your privileged existence. Imagine having to starve yourself just to prove you were too important to lift a finger. This aesthetic often blurred dangerously with religious devotion, particularly a practice of fasting for piety. Many holy women of the era, revered for their spiritual asceticism, were effectively anorexic. They would engage in extreme fasting, sometimes consuming only the Eucharist for weeks on end, believing that by denying the body, they were elevating the soul. The lines between genuine religious devotion and unhealthy, self-destructive eating patterns were virtually non-existent, making it easy to mask a dangerous obsession with a veneer of spiritual purity. You weren't just starving yourself, you were communing with God. The pressure to maintain this fragile, delicate image was constant and relentless. Society demanded that you present a certain silhouette, a certain ethereal quality, even at the cost of your own health and vitality. This wasn't just about what you ate, it was about how you presented yourself, how you moved, how you seemed to exist almost on a different plane. The physical manifestation of your beauty was inextricably linked to this fragile, often sickly ideal, ensuring that a woman's relationship with food was often one of profound anxiety and self-denial. And the consequence of this diet of desire? Malnourishment, of course. A body weakened by insufficient food became far more susceptible to the myriad of diseases that plagued the medieval world. Shortened lifespans, already precarious due to poor sanitation and rudimentary medicine, became even shorter. Your beauty, achieved through self-starvation, literally made you more fragile, more vulnerable, and more likely to succumb to the next wave of illness that swept through the village or court. It was a slow, deliberate form of self-sabotage, all for the sake of conforming to an ideal that was beautiful only in its tragic, fleeting fragility. A truly twisted curse indeed. Now, let's throw a real medieval curveball into our tragic tale of beauty, the Black Death and the pox. Because when the bubonic plague came knocking, or when smallpox ravaged the population, your carefully cultivated pale skin, your high forehead, your ethereal fragility, it all became utterly, devastatingly irrelevant. The Black Death was the ultimate equalizer, A grim reminder that in the face of widespread mortality, earthly beauty offered absolutely no protection. In fact, if anything, it might have drawn people closer, making you a more effective vector for the very disease that would claim you. Imagine the horror. One day you're admired, desired, a woman of striking beauty. The next, your face is covered in weeping pustules, your skin turning black from the ravages of the plague, your body racked with fever. Smallpox, in particular, often left permanent, disfiguring pockmarks, rendering any previous beauty utterly meaningless. Your captivating features were destroyed, your allure evaporated, replaced by a grotesque mask of disease. All those dangerous cosmetics, all that painful plucking, for what? To be reduced to a disfigured, dying husk just like everyone else. The swiftness of death in these epidemics left no time for vanity, no time to admire oneself, no time to even acknowledge the loss of one's beauty. When death was quite literally knocking on the door, dragging away entire families, the fleeting appeal of physical attractiveness was simply moot. You were fighting for your life, not for your looks. Your final moments were not spent admiring your reflection, but gasping for breath, surrounded by the stench of sickness and despair. It was a brutal, existential slap in the face to anyone who had ever valued superficiality. And in a world without germ theory, where the cause of disease was attributed to divine wrath, bad air, or demonic influence, your beauty could even be seen as a potential vector for contagion. Close contact with anyone, beautiful or not, was a gamble. But if you were a renowned beauty, your allure might draw others closer, increasing the risk of transmission. Your admirers, in their desire for proximity, were literally putting their lives at stake, and you, by simply being attractive, inadvertently became a conduit for death. A truly dark irony. Your most desirable trait could be the very thing that spread your doom. It was the ultimate, stark, and brutal reminder of the vanity of life. Earthly beauty, so highly prized, so desperately sought, so dangerously acquired, was fleeting, fragile, and utterly meaningless in the face of widespread mortality. It could be stripped away in an instant, leaving behind only the cold, hard reality of death. The curse of beauty wasn't just about social or spiritual peril. It was about the profound, physical emptiness of its promises when faced with the truly indifferent forces of nature and disease. A terrifying thought to drift off to sleep with, isn't it? Let's delve deeper into the psychological burden, because long before sociologists coined the term objectification, medieval women were living it, breathing it, and suffering under its oppressive weight every single day. If you were beautiful, you weren't just being looked at, you were being consumed by the eyes of others, reduced to an aesthetic form, a pleasing visual, rather than a sentient human being with thoughts, feelings, and a soul. Your very presence became a performance, whether you liked it or not. This was the male gaze in its nascent, unfiltered, unapologetically dominant form. Women were primarily visual commodities, their value largely derived from their appeal to men, their ability to be admired, desired, and perhaps acquired. Your identity wasn't about who you were, but about how you looked to others. Your internal world, your rich inner life, was irrelevant. What mattered was the external packaging, the surface presentation, the immediate aesthetic impact. It was a profound, daily dehumanization, where your beauty became both your public identity and your private torment. This led to a pervasive lack of respect for personhood. Your intellect, your skills, your character, your wisdom, all too often, these profound qualities were disregarded in favor of your superficial appearance. You might be a brilliant strategist, a skilled artisan, a compassionate healer, but if you were also beautiful, those accomplishments were frequently overshadowed, even dismissed, by the relentless focus on your face. You were the beautiful one, and that often meant you were nothing else. Your thoughts were secondary, your voice unheard, your contributions undervalued, all because your looks stole the show. Can you imagine the feeling of being perpetually on display? The constant scrutiny, the uninvited evaluations, the pervasive judgment based solely on your looks? Every social gathering, every public appearance, every interaction became an unspoken audit of your physical attributes. You were constantly being measured, weighed, and assessed, not for your character, but for your aesthetic appeal. It was like living in a perpetual beauty pageant, but one where the judges were everywhere, their decisions were final, and the stakes were your entire future. And your feelings, your thoughts, your opinions, they were often considered secondary, if considered at all, to your ornamental value. Your role was to be pleasing to the eye, to be agreeable, to be a silent, beautiful presence. To express strong opinions, to assert your will, to challenge male authority, these were actions that often conflicted with the expectation of a beautiful, docile object. Your inner life was a secret, often suppressed world, hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of beauty and compliance. It was a suffocating existence, where your most visible asset became a heavy cloak of invisibility for your true self. You'd think, wouldn't you, that in a world so harsh, women would stick together, form bonds, share the burdens, support each other against the myriad threats. But for the medieval beauty, her curse often meant isolation, particularly from her own female peers. That simmering pot of jealousy and resentment we touched upon earlier could boil over, creating deep rifts and making genuine friendship a rare and precious commodity. Her attractiveness, far from building bridges, often erected formidable walls. Friendship struggles were a daily reality. Other women, seeing her as direct competition for husbands, especially if they came from respectable, property-owning families, for resources, or for social standing within the tightly knit communities, might deliberately exclude her. She was a threat, a disruptor, an unfair advantage in a world where opportunities were scarce and securing a good marriage was paramount for survival. So, rather than camaraderie, she often found herself facing suspicion and hostility from the very people she might have sought solace with. This exclusion from social circles was a particularly cruel form of punishment. Imagine being the subject of the beautiful outcast narrative, where your attractiveness, instead of making you popular, made you a pariah among your female contemporaries. The quiet conversations that ceased when you approached, the invitations that never came, the shared laughter that suddenly died down, these were all subtle yet profoundly painful forms of social rejection. It was a loneliness amplified by the constant presence of others, a constant reminder of your difference. The petty cruelties were endless. Snubs in public, cold shoulders in the marketplace, deliberately spreading rumors, even minor ones, about your conduct or character, or actively excluding you from vital female networks like spinning bees or communal gatherings. These weren't just mean-spirited acts. They were strategic moves to undermine your social standing, to lessen your appeal, and to reinforce your isolation. It was a constant barrage of microaggressions designed to chip away at your confidence and ensure you knew your place, which was, apparently, alone. This made it incredibly difficult to form genuine bonds of trust and connection. How could you confide in someone who secretly resented you? How could you share your vulnerabilities with someone who might use them as fodder for gossip? The constant awareness of being judged or envied for your appearance created an impenetrable barrier, preventing the kind of intimacy and shared experience that forms the foundation of true friendship. Every interaction was tinged with caution, every compliment viewed with suspicion. So, ironically, beauty, which in modern society might be seen as a pathway to popularity and social acceptance, often served as a wall in the Middle Ages. Rather than a bridge to connection, it served as a barrier, isolating her from potential allies, from sources of comfort, and from the shared female experience that could have provided much-needed resilience in a brutal world. Her curse wasn't just outward. It was deeply, heartbreakingly inward, forcing her to navigate a lonely existence in a society that simultaneously coveted and condemned her. If you thought the external pressures were immense, let's talk about the internal ones, the silent, relentless burden of expectation that came with the beautiful one. It wasn't enough to simply possess beauty. You were expected to embody it, constantly, effortlessly, flawlessly. This wasn't a choice. It was a demanding, unforgiving role, a 24/7 performance with no off days, no sick leave, and certainly no allowance for a bad hair day. The constant pressure was exhausting. To maintain her looks, which often involved painful and dangerous rituals, was a daily chore. But beyond that, she was expected to always be charming, always agreeable, never to show weakness, and certainly never to appear anything less than radiant. Her mood, her health, her personal struggles, they were all secondary to the imperative of presenting a consistently pleasing, attractive facade. It was a suffocating demand for perfection in a deeply imperfect world. There were simply no bad days allowed. Imagine being expected to be radiant, agreeable, and aesthetically pleasing, even when ill, with a fever, exhausted from childbearing, or grieving a profound loss. Your public face had to remain serene, your smile unwavering, your composure impeccable. To appear anything less was seen as a personal failing, a breach of your unspoken contract with society to be the beautiful, charming ornament everyone expected. It was a profound erasure of your humanity, reducing you to a mere visual prop. This relentless expectation led to the sheer exhaustion of performance. Living up to an impossible, perpetual ideal, always on stage, always aware of being watched and judged, would drain anyone of their vitality. The psychological toll of constantly having to project an image of effortless beauty and serene grace, while grappling with the very real discomforts and dangers of medieval life, must have been immense. It's a kind of quiet, internal suffering that beauty both demanded and disguised. And the fear of aging? Oh, it was a terrifying prospect. The inevitable decline of beauty was not just a natural process. It signaled a profound loss of power, influence, and value. Your worth was inextricably tied to your face, and as that face began to show the ravages of time, so too did your standing in the world begin to wane. It was a countdown to irrelevance, a horrifying march towards becoming invisible in a society that had once celebrated your every feature. So beauty became a demanding, unforgiving job. It required impeccable maintenance, unwavering good humor, and a constant, vigilant effort to present a flawless front. There were no holidays, no sick days, and a very short career trajectory, culminating in the inevitable, terrifying loss of your most valuable asset. It was a role that promised much, but delivered endless pressure, a gilded burden that weighed heavily on the soul, making your celebrated feature your most profound curse. Perhaps, in moments of fleeting comfort, a beautiful medieval woman might have held on to a hopeful, yet ultimately misguided belief that her beauty might somehow serve as a shield, that it would soften the blows of a harsh world, grant her special privileges, or offer a modicum of protection against the incessant cruelties of medieval existence. It was an illusion, a fragile veneer of security that, with crushing regularity, failed her precisely when she needed it most. This was the illusion of protection. The idea that a pleasing countenance might exempt you from the pervasive dangers, the social injustices, or the sheer brutal randomness of medieval life. You might think, surely my lord will be kinder to me, my attackers will hesitate, my family will treat me better because I am beautiful. But the world, as you've seen, rarely worked that way. Your attractiveness was often a magnet for trouble, not a repellent. It opened doors, yes, but often to very dangerous rooms. The disappointment was therefore profound when attractiveness didn't prevent suffering, didn't ward off injustice, and certainly didn't stop the cruelties of life from raining down. It wasn't a magic force field. A beautiful woman could still be beaten, abused, neglected, ravaged by disease, or accused of witchcraft, just like any other. Her beauty didn't make her immune. It often just made her suffering more visible, more ironic, more tragic in the eyes of others. The shield was imaginary, and the blows were very, very real. Beneath that veneer of beauty, she was still just a woman in a brutal, patriarchal world. Her physical appearance, however striking, did not fundamentally alter her societal position or her inherent vulnerability. The silks she wore, the jewels that adorned her, these were external trappings. Internally, she carried the same fears, the same anxieties, the same fundamental lack of power as her plainer sisters. Her beauty was a dazzling disguise, not an impenetrable fortress. So she was let down, not just by society, but by the very quality that was supposed to make her special or protected. Her most celebrated trait, the one everyone admired, ultimately betrayed her, failing to provide the sanctuary or the advantage it seemed to promise. It was a cruel trick of fate, to be given a gift that brought more peril than privilege, more exposure than protection. The very thing that made her stand out also made her stand alone in her moments of greatest need. Ultimately, her beauty was not a fortress, but a gilded cage. It offered the appearance of luxury, of privilege, of power, but it simultaneously restricted her movement, limited her choices, and exposed her to a unique set of dangers. It was a beautifully crafted prison where the bars were made of admiration, desire, and expectation. And the bitterest irony? She was often trapped inside precisely because she was deemed too beautiful to be truly free. As if the physical dangers and social pressures weren't enough, Let's add another delightful layer to the medieval curse of beauty: extortion and blackmail. Because if you were a beautiful woman, particularly one with any connection to wealth or power, your reputation, often meticulously tied to your looks and perceived virtue, became a valuable bargaining chip for the unscrupulous schemers lurking in every corner of medieval society. Your allure wasn't just a target, it was leverage. Leverage for schemers was everywhere. Your good name, your family's honor, any hint of scandal or impropriety, these were all assets that could be exploited by individuals looking to gain wealth, influence, or revenge. A beautiful woman, being so visible and so scrutinized, was an easy target. Any perceived misstep, any moment of vulnerability, any private indiscretion could be twisted, exaggerated, and then held over her head for maximum gain. You were a pawn, but a very valuable one in the dark arts of medieval manipulation. Think about secret admirers turned tormentors. Those you spurned, those whose advances you rejected, might not simply disappear. Their wounded pride could fester, turning into a desire for revenge. They might threaten to reveal perceived indiscretions, fabricate scandalous tales, or hint at affairs that never happened. In a world where a woman's reputation was so fragile, even a baseless rumor could destroy her. So your refusal of an unwanted suitor could lead directly to a lifetime of living under the threat of exposure, your beauty having inspired both admiration and vengeful malice. Political enemies, too, found your beauty an excellent weapon. If your husband was a powerful lord, his pride in his beautiful wife was a vulnerability. Your attractiveness, or any real or imagined scandal associated with it, could be used against him through public humiliation, fabricated love letters, or cunningly spread rumors about your infidelity. Undermining the wife was a subtle yet effective way to undermine the husband's authority and prestige, all with your face as the unwitting weapon. This often meant that the cost of silence was incredibly high. You might have to pay significant sums to keep secrets hidden, to prevent rumors from spreading, or to appease a blackmailer. This wasn't just about money, it was about saving your reputation, your marriage, and possibly your very life. Every payout was a bitter reminder that your beauty, far from being a gift, was a liability, costing you dearly just to maintain a fragile semblance of normalcy. So her attractiveness made her valuable, yes, but valuable to those who sought to exploit her. It was a perverse irony. The very quality that set her apart also made her a prime target for exploitation, blackmail, and extortion. Your face wasn't just your own. It was a potential gold mine for those with a cynical eye and an empty purse, ensuring that even your most celebrated trait could become a source of endless anxiety and financial drain. At its core, the curse of medieval beauty was a profound loss of agency. Your physical appearance, which seemed to promise so much, became the primary determinant of your life's path, but rarely a path you chose. Your beauty didn't grant you freedom. It dictated your choices, but those choices were almost always made by everyone else. A life dictated by looks was the grim reality. Your attractiveness often determined your marriage prospects, the status of your family's alliances, your position at court, if any, and even whether you were deemed suitable for a religious life. You weren't asked what you wanted. You were assigned a role based on what your face could achieve for others. Your identity was externally imposed, shaped by the demands and desires of a patriarchal society. not by your own burgeoning self. There were precious few avenues for true self-determination. Personal desires, unique talents, unless they were conveniently ornamental, or individual aspirations were consistently secondary to what your face could achieve for your family or lineage. You might yearn for scholarship, for adventure, for a quiet life, but if your beauty presented a more advantageous path in the eyes of your male guardians, then that was the path you were forced to take. Your dreams were irrelevant. Your face was destiny. So beauty became a gilded cage, in the most literal sense. It offered seemingly attractive options: a rich husband, a prestigious court position, a life of luxury, but these were rarely options she genuinely chose for herself. They were choices made for her, by others, for their benefit, leveraging her appearance as a tool. She might reside in a beautiful palace, wear magnificent gowns, and be surrounded by opulence, but she was, nonetheless, imprisoned by the expectations that came with her face. The illusion of control was perhaps the cruelest aspect. A beautiful woman might believe her looks gave her power, a subtle sway over men, a certain influence, but in reality, it severely restricted her true freedom. The power she seemed to possess was ephemeral, contingent, and ultimately an illusion. The moment she tried to exert genuine control, to make a choice contrary to what was expected, she would quickly discover the sharp, unyielding limits of her supposed influence. Her body, her face, her future, all too often these were treated as external property, to be managed, controlled, and exploited by men. She was not the proprietor of her own existence. She was merely the vessel, the commodity. And beneath the surface of that beautiful, composed exterior, there was often a silent scream, the cry of a life unchosen, a destiny dictated not by her soul, but by the relentless, all-consuming dictates of her face, a truly profound and devastating curse. If a beautiful woman's life was a perilous journey, then becoming a beautiful widow was like reaching a brief, treacherous oasis, only to find yourself surrounded by circling vultures. An attractive widow, especially one with inherited property or wealth, was a notoriously dangerous combination in medieval society. She was now a free agent, however briefly, with assets, and thus became a prime target for every ambitious, unscrupulous, or simply opportunistic man within a 100-mile radius. The pressure to remarry was immense and immediate. For her own family, it was about securing alliances, protecting her inherited property, which might be vulnerable without a male guardian, or simply adhering to the pervasive belief that women were incomplete or unprotected without male guardianship. For other families, it was about acquiring her wealth and her person. Her brief window of autonomy, the fleeting taste of managing her own affairs, was usually slammed shut by a relentless parade of persistent suitors and suffocating family pressure. Her looks and assets, far from granting her independence, made her irresistible to those who sought to control her. She became a target for fortune hunters and unscrupulous relatives. Imagine the scene. Your husband is barely cold in the ground, and already a queue of men, some genuinely interested, others eyeing your land, are at your door. Distant cousins you've never met, landless knights, ambitious merchants, all saw your beauty and your newfound independence as an opportunity. Your grief was often cut short, replaced by the exhausting and often terrifying need to fend off these opportunistic men seeking to marry you, control your wealth, or simply take advantage of your vulnerable state. Her autonomy, that brief, intoxicating whiff of freedom, was constantly threatened. She might have hoped to manage her own estate, raise her children as she saw fit, or even choose a life of religious contemplation. But the prevailing societal norms, coupled with the relentless pressure from men who saw her as a valuable prize, ensured that her window of self-determination was remarkably short. Her looks and her inheritance combined to make her a magnet for trouble, ensuring she would rarely be left to her own devices. So her grief, her very mourning period, was often brutally cut short. There was no time to process the loss of her husband. Instead, she was thrust into a new battle, defending her independence against the onslaught of opportunistic men. Her beauty, which had brought her so much attention in life, continued to haunt her even in widowhood, ensuring that peace and quiet remained elusive. It was a cruel continuation of the curse, ensuring that even in personal tragedy, her allure continued to be a source of profound danger and pressure. Now, let's descend from the gilded halls of nobility to the bustling, often grimy, world of the noble household, because the curse of beauty was by no means confined to queens and ladies. For a female servant, particularly when blessed with attractive features, her position was perilous in the extreme, fraught with unique dangers that often stemmed directly from her looks and her vulnerability. The vulnerability to masters was ever present. A beautiful female servant was often subjected to sexual exploitation, harassment, or unwanted advances from the lord of the house, his sons, or even powerful male guests. In a time where class divisions were absolute, and a servant's consent was utterly meaningless in the face of a master's will, her attractiveness was a direct pipeline to abuse. There was no escape, no refuge, and certainly no authority to appeal to. Her beauty was not a source of pride, but a constant, gnawing threat to her safety and her body. She had virtually no protection. Few avenues for complaint existed. Little legal recourse was available, and often there was no one to believe her story, let alone defend her. If she resisted, she could be beaten, dismissed, or worse. If she conceived a child, it would be hers alone to bear, often with profound social stigma and even greater hardship. The master's word was law, and her body was, in essence, his for the taking, if he so desired. Her beauty, then, became a cruel trap, highlighting her powerlessness. And then there was the jealousy from mistresses. If she caught the eye of the lord, the lady of the house, often herself trapped in an arranged marriage and powerless against her husband's infidelities, might turn her rage and frustration squarely on the beautiful servant. Her life could be made a misery through petty cruelties, excessive workloads, or trumped-up accusations, leading to dismissal, public humiliation, or even physical violence. Her beauty, which promised potential advancement, instead made her a target for the wrath of those above her. The fallen woman narrative was particularly brutal for beautiful servants. If she was exploited, if she became pregnant, if her reputation was sullied, it was seen as her fault, a sign of her moral failing, rather than a tragic consequence of her vulnerable position and the systemic abuse of power. Her beauty was deemed the active agent, leading men astray, rather than the innocent quality that made her a target. She bore the full brunt of the shame and social ostracization, while the powerful men responsible often faced no consequences. So her life was a constant tightrope walk, balanced precariously between survival, the distant possibility of advancement, perhaps a good marriage to another servant, if she was lucky, and the ever-present danger of exploitation. Her beauty, instead of offering comfort or advantage, merely amplified the inherent risks of her lowly position, making her life a constant, terrifying gamble, a truly unenviable fate, where your face became a flashing danger sign in a world that offered no safety nets. Let's not make the mistake of thinking this curse of beauty was solely the purview of the nobility, those cloaked in silks and living in castles. Oh no, the mud-splashed fields and cramped, smoke-filled hovels of the common folk harbored their own unique brand of medieval misery for the beautiful. A beautiful peasant girl faced her own distinct set of curses, far removed from courtly intrigues, but no less brutal, and often even more unavoidable. Her life was often even more vulnerable, as she lived under the shadow of the lord's droit du seigneur, the feudal lord's perceived, and often enforced, right to sleep with a newlywed bride on his land, or, indeed, any desirable female under his domain. Her beauty, in this context, made her a prime and likely target for this horrific abuse of power. It wasn't about charming a king. It was about surviving the whims of a powerful, local tyrant who saw her as just another part of his property, to be used as he pleased. And unlike her noble counterparts, the beautiful peasant girl had significantly less protection. There was no powerful family to intervene, no intricate legal system to appeal to, beyond the Lord's own self-serving justice, and often no one to stand up for her against the overwhelming authority of the Lord or his men. Her fate was often sealed by her Lord's whims, her life dictated by his desires, and her body, regrettably, considered his for the taking. Her beauty, far from elevating her, often just brought her directly into the path of unimaginable horror. Her marriage options, if she was even allowed to choose, were also significantly curtailed and, paradoxically, elevated and risky by a powerful man. She might be plucked from the fields to become a lord's mistress, a position of fleeting luxury but immense danger and social ostracization. Or she could simply be abducted and forced into a union with a man of her lord's choosing, perhaps a favored retainer, effectively elevating her status, but stripping her of any personal agency whatsoever. Her beauty, while offering a different path, rarely offered a better or safer one. The harsh realities of peasant life meant that beauty didn't provide comfort, didn't magically escape her from back-breaking toil, and certainly didn't guarantee a full belly. In fact, it often just added another layer of vulnerability, another set of eyes to fear, another set of hands to avoid. Her physical attractiveness was a liability in the fields as much as it was in the castle, drawing unwanted attention from men who saw her as easy prey, with no one to stand between her and their desires. So whether in court or in cottage, the curse of beauty was universal. It was a relentless, pervasive force that warped a woman's life, making her a target, a pawn, and often a victim. It served as a stark, brutal reminder that in the Middle Ages, some gifts were far, far more dangerous than any burden. And for the beautiful peasant girl, her beauty often led to a life of exploitation and hardship, rather than the fairy tale ending that modern minds might mistakenly imagine. Now, let's anchor these abstract horrors with some concrete examples. And who better to start with than one of the most magnificent, influential, and undeniably beautiful women of the Middle Ages, Eleanor of Aquitaine. You probably know her name. She was renowned across Europe, not just for her striking looks, but for her formidable intelligence, her vibrant personality, and her astonishing political acumen. She was, in short, a rock star queen. But even for Eleanor, her unparalleled beauty and charisma proved to be less a blessing and more a deeply complicated, often terrifying curse. Her beauty was such that she secured marriages to not one, but two kings. First, Louis VII of France, then, after a rather messy divorce, the younger, more vibrant Henry II of England. These were not minor unions. These were incredibly powerful alliances, effectively linking the destinies of two of Europe's most influential kingdoms. Her face, her lineage, and her vast dowry of Aquitaine were the ultimate bargaining chips, propelling her to the pinnacle of European power. She was the envy of every court, the dazzling prize that united, and later divided, empires. But with such power and such beauty came an immense burden of expectation. She was expected to produce heirs, specifically male heirs, to secure these vital alliances, and always, always to look impeccable, a radiant symbol of royal prestige. Her every move was scrutinized, her every word weighed, her every gown judged. She was a living, breathing emblem of her husband's power, and any perceived flaw, any sign of weakness, any failure to conform reflected directly on him and, by extension, on the entire kingdom. And the fallout? Oh, the fallout was spectacular and deeply personal. Her marriage to Louis VII dissolved amidst rumors of her alleged affairs and her failure to produce a male heir, at least quickly enough. Her second marriage to Henry II, initially passionate, spiraled into outright hostility. Eleanor was accused of adultery, embroiled in political intrigues, often orchestrated by Henry himself, and eventually suffered a lengthy imprisonment by her own husband. For 16 agonizing years, she was effectively a royal prisoner, separated from her children, her power, and her beloved Aquitaine. All the while, her rebellious sons, whom she allegedly encouraged, waged war against their father. So the crucial question remains, did her unparalleled beauty, her undeniable charisma, ultimately make her life easier or harder? A compelling argument can be made that her allure, while undoubtedly securing her initial ascent to incredible power and prestige, ultimately drew her into perilous political waters and profound personal misery. Her beauty made her visible, made her desirable, made her a powerful piece on the chessboard. But it also made her a target, a pawn to be controlled, and ultimately a prisoner of her own formidable charisma, a truly magnificent curse embodied in one of history's most fascinating women. Let's turn to another figure whose beauty propelled her to dizzying heights, only to dash her down with brutal force. Agnes Sorel, the legendary Lady of Beauty. This was a woman whose striking looks and audacious personality captured King Charles VII of France, making her not just his mistress, but an incredibly influential and deeply scandalous figure at court. She was the medieval equivalent of a supermodel who suddenly gained immense political power, and everyone hated her for it. Agnes broke every protocol. She wasn't just beautiful, she was brazenly, unapologetically so. Her fashion choices were scandalous, even for a court where modesty was hardly absolute. She famously wore gowns that exposed one, or sometimes both, of her breasts at court, creating a sensation and infuriating the more conservative elements. Her opulence, her perceived influence over the king, and her sheer audacity caused outrage among the nobility, the queen, Marie of Anjou, and the Dauphin, the future Louis XI, all of whom saw her as a dangerous threat to the established order and their own power. She was too much, too visible, too powerful for a woman not born into royalty. She amassed immense wealth and property, granted to her by the besotted king. She used her influence to advance her family and friends, further infuriating those who believed she had no place in such matters. Her mere presence was a constant affront to the queen, who was repeatedly humiliated by Charles VII's blatant favoritism. Agnes became a symbol of the king's moral laxity, a visual representation of the court's perceived decadence, and a convenient scapegoat for any political or social malaise. Her beauty made her impossible to ignore, and her influence made her utterly detestable to those who stood to lose from her rise. And then, her sudden, mysterious death. At the height of her power and influence, Agnes died very abruptly in 1450 at the age of 28. While initially attributed to dysentery, later forensic examinations of her remains in the 20th century revealed high concentrations of mercury, far beyond what would be used in contemporary beauty regimens. This led to strong speculation that she was poisoned, likely by a jealous rival or a political enemy who saw her as too dangerous to live. Her beauty, which had brought her so much, ultimately brought her to a very early, very violent end. So, Agnes Sorel paid the ultimate price. For daring to be beautiful, for daring to be powerful, for daring to defy societal norms, and for wielding influence in a world that abhorred an uncontrolled woman, she met a tragic, violent end. Her beauty was her undoing, a dangerous magnet for both royal adoration and deadly hatred. Her story is a stark reminder that, in the Middle Ages, to be a dazzling, influential beauty was often to be a marked woman, destined for a glorious but ultimately cursed and tragically brief existence. Let's pivot to a woman whose beauty was not just a curse, but arguably a tool in her ruthless ascent to power, Isabella of France, infamously known as the she-wolf of France. She was renowned across Europe as a great beauty, a daughter of the French king, and she was married to the rather unfortunate Edward II of England. Her looks were universally praised, her charm undeniable, and her presence at court must have been captivating. This was, initially, a classic political union. Her striking looks were part of the package, designed to cement an alliance between England and France. But the marriage soured spectacularly. Edward II, a man widely believed to have preferred male companions and who openly favored his male favorites, neglected his beautiful queen. This perceived neglect, coupled with Edward's blatant disregard for Isabella's position and her political insights, led to a dramatic marital breakdown that escalated into a full-blown political crisis. Her beauty couldn't secure her husband's affection, but it certainly highlighted his perceived deficiencies. Isabella, however, was no meek, suffering queen. She was a woman of immense cunning and ruthless ambition. She used her charm, her intelligence, and her considerable political acumen to gain allies, eventually fleeing England, raising an invasion force in France, with the help of her lover, Roger Mortimer, and orchestrating the deposition of her own husband. Edward II was imprisoned and later, almost certainly, brutally murdered under her regime. She became, for a time, the de facto ruler of England, a queen who not only survived, but thrived by utterly destroying her husband. So the intriguing question emerges: did her disarming beauty aid her brutality? Did her captivating appearance make her opponents underestimate her political prowess and her capacity for violence? Perhaps men, accustomed to seeing beautiful women as docile ornaments, failed to perceive the steel beneath Isabella's elegant exterior. Her charm could have been a powerful weapon, drawing people to her cause, convincing them of her righteous indignation, and masking her true, ruthless intentions until it was too late. Her power was initially gained through charm, through her ability to appeal to others, to gather support, and to project an image of wronged innocence. But ultimately, that power was wielded with a terrifying, bloody hand. Isabella of France proves that beauty, while a curse in many ways, could also be a formidable, almost deceptive weapon. It could disarm, it could attract, it could influence. But in her hands, it also facilitated a terrifying ascent to power, making her a beauty who became a truly terrifying force. A testament to how multifaceted and how dangerous this particular medieval curse could be. Now for a different kind of beauty, one that shows the curse wasn't always about physical allure, but about the profound, unsettling power of a woman's presence. Let's talk about Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. Her beauty wasn't conventional physical beauty in the way we've been discussing. It was a spiritual, almost transcendent charisma, an untouched purity, and an unwavering conviction that captivated followers and confounded her enemies. She was beautiful in her absolute faith, in her undeniable courage, and in her magnetic sincerity. This unconventional attractiveness, her almost angelic purity, her youth, and her unwavering faith inspired incredible devotion among soldiers and common folk alike. They saw her as chosen by God, a virgin warrior sent to save France. Her presence on the battlefield, her rallying cries, and her sheer, unwavering belief in her divine mission instilled courage and loyalty in men who had previously been demoralized. She was a beacon of hope, and her beauty was an inner radiance that drew people to her cause with an almost irresistible force. But this very power, this magnetic influence of an uncontrolled woman, made her an existential threat to the established order. A powerful, charismatic, and beautiful young woman who dared to defy gender norms, who wore men's clothing, who commanded armies, and who claimed direct divine guidance. This was profoundly unsettling. She didn't fit into any of the predefined boxes for women. She wasn't a noble pawn, a demure wife, or a cloistered nun. She was something entirely new, entirely disruptive, and therefore entirely dangerous in the eyes of the church and her enemies. Inevitably, this led to accusations of heresy and witchcraft. Her unnatural influence, her astonishing success on the battlefield, her ability to inspire men, all were attributed to demonic powers by her English and Burgundian enemies. They couldn't rationalize her power within their worldview, so they demonized it. Her visions were not divine, they were devilish. Her charm was not purity, it was enchantment. Her very existence, her powerful, undeniable feminine presence, became a direct challenge to the patriarchal structures of both church and state, and thus had to be explained away as evil. Her physical appearance, or more accurately, her complete lack of concern for it, was paradoxically both a strength and a target. Her simple, unadorned look, her famously short hair, symbolized her purity and her rejection of worldly vanity, making her a symbol of divine grace to her followers. But it also made her a target for those who sought to discredit her, accusing her of cross-dressing, a serious offense, and further associating her with the devil. Her end was, of course, one of the most horrific in history. Accused of witchcraft and heresy, she was burned at the stake, a fiery, agonizing death for a woman whose beauty was her conviction and whose curse was her unwavering power. Let's return to the subtle, insidious heart of the curse of beauty, the profound illusion of choice. You might think that being desirable would open up myriad pathways, offering a woman greater freedom to choose her destiny. But in the Middle Ages, your perceived value, derived primarily from your attractiveness, often dictated the range of your future options, whether for marriage, courtly position, or even a life in the church. These were not choices you made. They were choices made for you, by others, in response to your looks. There were heartbreakingly few avenues for genuine self-determination. Your personal desires, your unique talents, unless they perfectly aligned with ornamental or reproductive roles, or your deepest aspirations were consistently secondary. They were brushed aside, ignored, or simply deemed irrelevant compared to what your face could achieve for your family or lineage. Your beauty became a lens through which your entire life was filtered, and that lens was controlled by others. So beauty, rather than being a key to liberation, became a gilded cage. It offered seemingly attractive options: a marriage to a powerful lord, a life of luxury at court, perhaps even the status of a royal favorite. But these were rarely options she genuinely chose for herself. They were choices imposed, often with a velvet glove, but choices nonetheless enforced by societal and familial pressure. She might be living in splendor, but she was living a life unchosen, a destiny predetermined by the accident of her birth and the shape of her features. The struggle against these predetermined roles must have been immense. Many women found themselves trapped in lives dictated not by their own souls, not by their inner callings, but by the relentless, all-consuming expectations that came with their looks. They were forced into marriages they didn't want, into roles they despised, into lives that felt utterly foreign to their true selves. Their beauty, the very thing celebrated by others, became a source of profound internal conflict and resentment. This was the ultimate trap, thinking that beauty provided liberty, only to discover, with crushing finality, that it was merely a different kind of master. A master far more insidious than a plain existence, precisely because it was cloaked in the deceptive allure of privilege and admiration. Her beauty was not her own. It was a public trust, a family asset, a political tool, and a constant burden. And in that relentless appropriation, her true self, her agency, her very freedom was tragically, utterly lost. Let's dissect the medieval male gaze even further, because it was far more than just looking. It was a comprehensive worldview rooted in ownership, possession, and the public display of women as status symbols. If you were a beautiful woman, you were not just seen, you were owned by that gaze, categorized and assigned value within a patriarchal framework that reduced you to a collection of desirable attributes. From fathers to husbands to sons, a woman was consistently seen as property, and her beauty, that was simply a valuable asset within that framework, increasing her market value, her prestige, and her utility. You were like a prize horse or a magnificent piece of land. desirable, expensive, and utterly inanimate in terms of your own will. Your aesthetic appeal was simply another entry on the ledger of male possessions, a testament to the wealth and power of the man who owned you. Beauty, therefore, functioned as a potent status symbol. A man's beautiful wife or daughter didn't just bring joy, she elevated his standing, showcasing his wealth, his influence, and his good taste. Her allure reflected directly on him, a living testament to his success. It was like driving a fancy carriage or wearing an expensive fur. She was a visible sign of his social capital, to be admired, envied, and discussed, almost as if she were another prized possession in his collection. This led to the constant pressure of displaying her. Parading her at court, flaunting her as an asset during diplomatic events, or simply exhibiting her during social gatherings, her presence was a public declaration of the man's power. She was on show, an object of visual pleasure and admiration, her role to enhance the prestige of her male protector. Her body, her face, her every graceful movement were all part of a curated performance designed to impress others, not to express herself. And as we've noted, her feelings were consistently secondary. Her emotional well-being, her personal desires, her inherent humanity, these were often disregarded in favor of her ornamental or reproductive value. Her comfort, her happiness, her very sense of self-worth were subordinated to her role as a beautiful object, a means to an end for the men who dictated her existence. You were there to look good, to be useful, and to cause no trouble. This inherent objectification, this reduction to a mere possession, was a profound dehumanization. It stripped women of their individuality, their intellect, their emotional complexity, and their spiritual depth. To be seen purely as an object, to be valued only for one's external attributes, was to be denied the very essence of human personhood. The medieval male gaze, therefore, wasn't just about appreciation, it was about dominion, a constant, oppressive reminder that your beauty was not for you, but for everyone else. Let's talk about the sheer, relentless exhaustion that came with the curse of beauty, the pressure to perform. It wasn't enough to simply be beautiful. You had to act beautiful, be charming, be agreeable, all the time without fail. This was a constant, draining performance, a role with no intermission, no curtain call, and absolutely no opportunity for an off switch. You were perpetually on stage, your very existence a continuous, demanding act. The constant scrutiny was pervasive. Every public appearance, every gesture, every interaction, every laugh, every word you uttered, it was all evaluated, judged, and dissected. Your posture, your smile, your wit, your graciousness, everything had to be perfect. There was no room for error, no allowance for human frailty. You were the beautiful one, and you had to live up to that impossible standard every waking moment. Imagine the mental toll of knowing you're always being watched, always being assessed. There was an unrelenting expectation to entertain, to charm, to be agreeable, to be a pleasant companion, a captivating presence, regardless of your own mood, your health, or your personal struggles. You were expected to brighten the room, to make others feel at ease, to be the very embodiment of grace and good cheer. To have a bad day, to feel sad, to be tired, these were luxuries you simply couldn't afford. Your emotions were not your own. They were part of the performance. This led to a profound suppression of true emotions, forcing a smile when your heart was breaking, holding back tears when you felt despair, masking fear when you felt vulnerable. These were daily acts of self-denial. Your authentic self, your genuine feelings, had to be hidden away, tucked behind a meticulously maintained facade of beauty and composure. It was a kind of emotional suffocation, where your inner turmoil was sacrificed for the sake of outward appearance. The toll of this perpetual performance was immense. The sheer exhaustion of living up to an impossible and relentless standard, day in and day out, would have been utterly draining. It wasn't just physical fatigue. It was a profound mental and emotional weariness, the constant effort of maintaining an idealized image, while grappling with the very real, often brutal, challenges of medieval life. It left little room for genuine self-care, for introspection, for anything beyond the performance. So, beauty became an unforgiving role, a constant job that required impeccable maintenance, unwavering good humor, and a constant, vigilant effort to present a flawless front. There were no holidays, no sick days, and a very short career trajectory, culminating in the inevitable, terrifying loss of your most valuable asset. It was a demanding, draining existence, a gilded burden that weighed heavily on the soul, ensuring that your celebrated feature was a constant source of profound, quiet suffering. And now, the final, most relentless cruelty of the curse of beauty, the inevitable march of time, because beauty is finite, ephemeral, and fleeting. And in the Middle Ages, with its shorter lifespans, harsher living conditions, and truly dangerous beauty regimens, beauty often faded faster, giving way to the dread of lost beauty and, consequently, lost power. The swift decline was often brutal. Medieval lifespans were considerably shorter than today, and the daily grind of life, poor diet, constant illness, frequent childbirth, manual labor, even for the wealthy, managing a large household was no joke, meant that youth and vitality often evaporated quickly. The dangerous beauty regimens, laden with lead and other toxins, actively accelerated this process, leaving women looking far older than their years. So, the beauty that brought you so much attention could vanish in a cruel instant, leaving you feeling adrift. With waning looks came a profound loss of influence. As your beauty faded, so did the attention, the compliments, the subtle power you once wielded. Your value, so inextricably tied to your face, diminished with every wrinkle, every gray hair, every sagging line. This was a grim reality for a woman whose worth had been primarily defined by her external appearance. You were no longer desired, no longer noticed, no longer relevant in a society that valued youth and allure above all else. This led to a terrifying fear of invisibility. The prospect of becoming an old hag after being celebrated as a belle was a truly horrifying fate. From being the center of attention, the object of desire, you faced the terrifying prospect of becoming invisible, marginalized, dismissed. The transition from celebrated beauty to ignored crone was a brutal, often isolating experience, leaving women feeling utterly worthless and profoundly alone. Desperate measures were often taken to stave off the inevitable. Women might continue dangerous beauty regimens, even as they harmed them, clinging to any hope of preserving their youth. They might resort to ever more elaborate disguises, heavy veils, or restrictive clothing to conceal the ravages of time. The battle against aging was a losing one, fought with toxic potions and painful contortions, all to delay the inevitable moment when society would declare them no longer beautiful and therefore no longer valuable. So, the ultimate curse of beauty was its very finitude. Beauty is a temporary loan, not a permanent possession. Its inevitable absence, often swift and brutal, could be profoundly devastating, stripping women of their identity, their influence, and their very sense of self-worth. To build your entire existence on such a fragile foundation was to guarantee a tragic downfall, and in the end, time, that most indifferent of medieval forces, always won. You've lived a life plagued by the curse of beauty, suffered its physical and emotional tolls, and witnessed its inevitable decline. But even in death, the curse wasn't quite finished with you, because in the deeply religious medieval world, your earthly beauty, and any vanity associated with it, had profound implications for your eternal soul. The Church made sure that even in the afterlife, your face could still cause you trouble. Women were taught, often with terrifying vividness, to contemplate eternal damnation for the sin of worldly vanity. Every moment spent preening, every expensive gown donned, every compliment savored, these were all tallied against your spiritual account. If you took undue pride in your God-given features, if you let your beauty distract you from piety, you were putting your immortal soul at severe risk, facing severe, agonizing punishment in the afterlife. The fires of hell were waiting, and your vanity was simply fueling them. The Church's teachings were unquestionable. Earthly delights, including physical beauty, were fleeting, temporary distractions. They were snares laid by the devil to divert humanity from the one true goal, spiritual salvation, achieved through piety, humility, and modesty. Your beauty was a test, a temptation, and if you succumbed to its allure, you were failing God. The message was clear: better to be plain and pious than beautiful and damned. This often led to a profound sense of repentance for beauty among devout women. Some actively sought to atone for their attractiveness, believing it made them more susceptible to sin and a greater temptation to others. They might engage in acts of penance, charity, or extreme austerity, hoping to counteract the spiritual burden of their physical blessings. Their beauty, a source of worldly admiration, became an inner burden, a constant source of spiritual anxiety. And then, the Grim Reaper, that great equalizer. At the moment of judgment, all earthly adornment, all physical beauty was stripped away. It became utterly irrelevant. Before God, your face meant nothing. What mattered was the state of your soul, the purity of your heart, the righteousness of your deeds. Your most lauded, most celebrated trait in life, the very thing that brought you so much attention and so much suffering, would be utterly meaningless, perhaps even detrimental in the ultimate reckoning. This was the final, most morbid irony of the curse of beauty. Your most desirable, most celebrated trait in life, the source of so much pain and danger, could be your direct ticket to hell in the next. It was a truly terrifying prospect, ensuring that even beyond the grave, the curse of your beauty continued to haunt you, twisting a seeming blessing into an eternal damnation. Good night, sweet prince or princess. May your dreams be less cursed and your soul perhaps less beautiful. So, here we are, as the flickering medieval candlelight signally gutters and the echoes of distant bells fade into the silence. We've journeyed through the dark, often bewildering landscape of the Middle Ages, meticulously uncovering why beauty, far from being a blessing, was a relentless, pervasive curse. It was a magnet for danger, a wellspring of jealousy, a potent tool for political manipulation, and a direct conduit for spiritual condemnation. We've seen its pervasive nature, affecting virtually every aspect of a woman's life. From her earliest days, when her face dictated her marriage prospects, to her adult life, where it exposed her to abduction, harassment, and the brutal demands of courtly power. We followed her through the perils of childbirth and the slow, agonizing decline of age, until it pursued her even beyond the grave, threatening her very salvation. Her beauty permeated every decision, every interaction, every fear, shaping her existence from birth to the grave and beyond into the afterlife. The tragic irony, therefore, is profound. A seemingly desirable trait, celebrated and coveted, often led to profound misery, crushing insecurity, and frequently a violent or tragic end. It was a gift that kept on taking, a blessing that was actually a burden, a crown of thorns disguised as a diadem. The very thing that made her stand out also made her stand alone, exposed, and vulnerable in a world that had little mercy for anyone, let alone a woman whose looks made her a target. And as you settle deeper into your slumber, a rhetorical question might gently tug at your sleepy mind. Are we truly free from these ancient anxieties? Do the echoes of this medieval curse still reverberate in modern society, albeit in subtler, perhaps more insidious forms? We no longer burn women for witchcraft, but do we still condemn them for their allure, judge them for their appearance, or restrict their agency based on their looks? Perhaps the gilded cage has merely been redesigned, its bars painted in brighter, more deceptive hues. So, let these final, dark thoughts linger. On the medieval perception of allure, on the brutal consequences for those who possessed it, and on the terrifying human folly of valuing superficiality over substance. A folly, it seems, that the medieval period perfected to a particularly brutal and often fatal degree. Sweet dreams. Or perhaps not so sweet. And so, as the shadows lengthen across your room and the weight of history, all that lead makeup, all those forced marriages, all that agonizing disfigurement finally settles upon your eyelids, I bid you adieu. Allow these unsettling historical truths to gently, or perhaps not so gently, guide you into a deep, possibly disquieting slumber. May the ghosts of medieval beauties, with their pale skin and plucked eyebrows, dance not too terrifyingly in your subconscious. A final sarcastic remark, if you please, about the enduring human folly of valuing superficiality over substance, and the medieval period's particularly brutal take on it. Because who needs genuine happiness or personal freedom when you can have a high forehead and a strategically emphasized belly, right? It truly makes you wonder what people will sacrifice for a fleeting aesthetic. We've learned nothing, have we? Now, go on. Close your eyes, and perhaps, just perhaps, as you drift off, think twice about wishing for historical beauty in your next reincarnation. Trust me on this one, it's really not worth it. May your slumber be free from lead makeup, from unwanted abductions, from forced marriages to decrepit lords, from jealous rivals, And most importantly, from any and all accusations of witchcraft. Good night, and may your dreams be significantly less cursed. Fade to black, or perhaps a lingering, slightly unnerving image of a medieval tapestry woven with threads of forgotten misery.